Hello, it's Phillip Taylor speaking from Richmond Green Chambers in London. I'm looking at a book today which has a very substantial amount of interest, I think, for people involved both in politics and in the legal systems, both national and international, when it comes to what we used to be referring to as military law. It's now, of course, looking at armed force conflict. The book is actually very interesting because it's similar to ones that I saw when I was in the army many years ago, called The Military Balance. But this book is called The War Report, Armed Conflict in 2014. It's in a second edition and it's been edited by Annyssa Bellal, and it comes from Oxford University Press. I hope I pronounced your name correctly. Unfortunately, sometimes I do get the the pronunciations slightly wrong. Now, my wife Elizabeth and I talked about the book, which we'll have a look at. It's a big one. And we gave it a review for our actual review title, an overview of armed conflicts worldwide and the legal issues generated by them. And we're covering the year 2014, and the book was published towards the end of last year, 2015, and I'm recording this in the early part of 2016. The review will be on the web and it will be in the journals. Let's have a look at the book first of all. It's a heavy book and it's a hardback. There it is, from OUP. There we go, there's the front. There's the actual spine, which you can see there. And then there's the back of it. And you can see it links in with a number of different organisations. You can see it's got the University of Geneva and the Graduate Institute in Geneva and so on. And it's a joint sort of publication. Now the book itself, as I said, heavy. It runs to 750 odd pages. There's the index right at the back, which gives you some idea of what's in it. And it's page numbering. So you should be able to find things reasonably well when you're looking. There's the actual front of the index there. You can see that there's a lot of footnoting, even at the bottom, just there right at the back. If we go to the front of the book, there we go, we've got the actual front page there. And of course you've got the people who are all linked in together with this publication. Then there are some disclaimers, some basic information there. And then there's an editor's preface, which is always worth reading. Basically puts her points of view forward. It's actually written with Dr. Stuart Casey Maslin as well, and it's dated June 2015. And then we get acknowledgements. Then after that we get the contents pages. It's split into parts. There's a summary at the beginning, a little bit about explaining what armed conflict is and what's going on, and the various areas in part 2, and then thematic chapters, which again run through. You can see there's a large amount of information given. Then there are a table of cases, because this is primarily a law book, not a military book, but I think there's quite an interesting overlap, because that is really where we're going at the moment, with certainly with a number of statements made very recently. There's a table of treaties covered there. And then UN resolutions, I think very important. They're often very heavily overlooked. Then you do have a list of abbreviations, which again, whenever you're dealing with anything with the military, it's always important to know what the abbreviations stand for, because they like to use them a lot. There we go, it runs into a few pages. Then there's an introduction to the work right at the beginning. And then after that, you get into what is called the summary. It's a little bit like an executive summary, in fact. It sets out where they are at the moment. It starts off in 2014, at least 42 armed conflicts occurred on the territory of 26 states and territories. Then they list them. And then you go on from there. As I say, it's a very erudite work in terms of its referencing, very scholastic. They've done a great deal of research all the way through, and that's the book. 750 odd pages, and I say it's a heavy book, but it's an interesting book and an interesting read, especially at the moment, because of what is happening in the world and the view of the world about armed conflicts, which is very different from, say, 40 years ago when I was in the army, or for that matter, the Second World War, on going back to the earlier conflicts where warfare was actually seen internationally perhaps a slightly different way from the way it is today. You have got the classic problem, for instance, in Britain, with a number of possible legal actions taking place against what the army did in Afghanistan. So you've got a fairly interesting development there, notwithstanding the political statements being made by certain people saying, well, this is not the right thing to do. So you can see again, and also of course the armed forces themselves, the senior officers making similar sort of comments. So you can see that there is an issue in terms of international law. Now, having said that, this is what we say about the book itself. How quickly armed conflicts, whether international or not, pass into history? The answer is actually very quickly. They certainly do. Published by OUP then in 2015 in association with the University of Geneva, this book chronicles every armed conflict that took place anywhere on the globe in 2014. We're now in 2016 and the world has moved on, and it's interesting, we think, indeed fascinating, to note that while some conflicts have been contained, at least to some extent, others have escalated alarmingly, unleashing such unspeakable brutality and misery that a refugee crisis involving millions has inevitably ensued. And this, again, is history repeating itself for those who read the history books, because it's not something that's new. It's happened before. Can I also say, notwithstanding what has been said in the book, that the number of armed conflicts taking place is actually quite low in comparative terms. Not that we're looking to compare previous years' worth. One of the series then of annual reports, this publication, which is on armed conflicts worldwide, covers about 800 pages. I said 750, but it's round about that, of documents and comments upon at least 42 armed conflicts that occurred within 26 states and territories. And that's the starting off point in the summary right at the beginning. Of these, there were 3 which the editors and contributors to this book designate as active international armed conflicts, and they are between India and Pakistan, between Israel and Syria, there's a footnote here, and between Palestine and Israel. And what you're seeing again is what has been said for decades, and that is that Israel in particular is, in terms of its military, probably the most experienced army now in the world because of what they are facing. And I think that's an important point to bear in mind in terms of international law in any event, whatever the rights or wrongs on both sides. So the term belligerent occupations is also used to describe situations that have continued in 10 states and territories, from Azerbaijan and Cyprus to the Ukraine and Western Sahara. These occupations, says the editor, are governed by the law of military occupation that also forms part of the law of international armed conflict. And I think that's the precedent that's being set here, and setting down exactly where we're going. The book's divided into 3 parts, with the first part concerning the defining and categorising of the various types and the levels of armed conflict. Part 2 then goes on to report on specific situations in armed conflict in 2014 in at least 30 different arenas, both of conflict and military occupation, including, for example, the military occupation of Ukraine and Georgia by the Russian Federation. Each chapter then in this section is preceded by a casualty list. And that again I think is of importance, not just to lawyers but to historians as well. Part 2, the most information-rich and revealing, provides detailed analyses, legal as well as sociological, of specific instances which point up certain key issues, namely the means and methods of warfare, protection and accountability. And the latter category includes informed discussion of such issues as war crimes, rendition and sexual violence, as well as youth violence, the possible causes and solutions, and criminal gangs. So whether or not you agree wholeheartedly with the facts stated and the opinions presented in this report, it's our view that it certainly succeeds in its stated aim of providing an overview, and a remarkably detailed and accessible overview it is, of the nature, range and impact of these conflicts, and the legal issues and legal consequences generated by them. And of course, it is the legalities and illegalities of armed conflict which many an international lawyer will be most concerned. And I've mentioned that before because I think we're entering, in the second half of this decade of the 21st century, we're entering an era where that's going to become predominant. It's certainly on the political agenda, and it's something I think internationally and globally we've got to think about. The editor then, Dr. Annyssa Bellal, by the way, is an international lawyer specialising in international, humanitarian, human rights and criminal law. So she comes to this subject with a substantial amount of knowledge. Let me conclude by saying that legal practitioners, including those involved in the planning and conduct of military operations or humanitarian endeavours, will find the legal orientation of this report extremely useful. I certainly did, and I also think it gives you a slightly different perspective on what you might, in my case, because I've been in the army, would have perhaps some preconceived ideas. So it does open one's mind up a little bit. The report also functions admirably as a massive reservoir of research and comment, which will certainly interest journalists and academics, as well as international lawyers. And that's really why we're putting it on the web, and it will be in the journals. Here's the book again, front page, spine, and then the back, and you can see the back sets out what's actually in the book and the people associated with it, because this is an important international effort. Let me just open right in the middle. Reflections on the conflict in Gaza, the right to self-defence under Juz ad Bellum and the Gaza 2014 conflict. We've been here before. There are quite a large amount of comments made specifically about Israel and of course the Israeli-Palestinian issues generally. But I do think that the book tries to achieve some balance because it is looking at international law. But I have to say, and it is a conclusion, that I think the book, generally speaking, takes a left of centre view on what is happening. I'm not saying there's anything wrong in that, but I think that's probably the approach that has actually been adopted with this publication. But I think it's a valuable contribution for anyone who's at staff college, anybody involved in military scholastic matters in the universities in terms of higher education, and certainly anybody involved in international law matters, because quite clearly this is an issue that is on the political agenda at the moment in terms of what is happening, where we are going because of the loss of life, all the other things that are happening. And I think it's a very valuable contribution to what is happening in 2016 onwards. So thank you to Annyssa, and also would like to thank all the contributors, because I haven't got a list of them to thank personally here, but I think they should be thanked for what is actually a very important work. Thank you to all concerned and to OUP for undertaking the publication. Bye-bye.